What if I told you that George Washington might not have been America's first president? We all grew up memorizing the same story. The Revolutionary War ended. The Constitution was signed. And in 1789, George Washington took office as the very first president of the United States. His portrait is on the dollar bill, his name on cities and monuments, his face carved into Mount Rushmore. Washington, the father of his country. But hidden in the shadows of history is another name, John Hanson. A man elected to lead the fragile new nation in 1781, 8 years before Washington ever took the oath of office. His role was so significant that some historians call him the forgotten first president of the United States. And here's where the story gets even stranger. For decades, photographs circulated of a black man named John Hanson. On social media, blogs, and even classrooms, people began asking, was the first president of the United States actually black? Was this the greatest story history never told? Whether myth, mistake, or deliberate erasure, this tale opens up a bigger question. Who decides what a history remembers and what it forgets? Conflict. To understand this controversy, we have to travel back to the chaotic years after the American Revolution. In 1781, the colonies had won their independence from Britain. But the United States was still more an idea than a country. There was no White House, no Constitution, and no executive branch as we know it. Instead, the newly liberated states were bound together under a fragile agreement called the Articles of Confederation. This system created something called the United States in Congress assembled. It wasn't a presidency like we imagine today, had no veto power, no standing army to command, no executive mansion. But it did have a leader, a presiding officer elected annually by the representatives of the states. The official title was President of the Continental Congress, and in November of 1781, that man was John Hanson, a statesman from Maryland. Hanson took office at a pivotal moment. The Revolutionary War was ending. Foreign alliances had to be managed. Debts had to be paid. And a newborn nation had to prove it could stand on its own. He signed official documents, oversaw committees, and was recognized by foreign powers. In the eyes of many, Hanson was the head of state, the first man to hold the title President of the United States in Congress assembled. But here's the problem. The Constitution of 1787 created a brand new office, a strong executive branch, and a presidency with powers far beyond what Hanson ever held. Washington was the first under this new system, and Hanson slowly slipped into obscurity. Over time, schoolbooks simplified the story. Washington was the first, and Hanson was forgotten. The nuance, the complexity, and the inconvenient truth that America had presidents before Washington was scrubbed away. And then, in the 20th century, something even more explosive happened. a photograph of a black man named John Hanson began circulating. This John Hanson lived in Liberia in the 1800s, long after the Revolution. Yet his image became tied to the Maryland politician, igniting rumors and claims that the first president of the United States was secretly a black man whose legacy had been erased. Whether by accident or intention, the confusion fueled a powerful narrative that history not only forgets, it erases. So who was John Hanson really? The historical John Hanson was born in Maryland in 1715, the descendant of European settlers. By the late 1770s, he had become a respected statesman. When the Articles of Confederation were ratified in 1781, Hanson was chosen by Congress to preside as the first president of the United States in Congress assembled. Now, let's be clear, his powers were limited. He could not command the army like Washington later did. He couldn't veto laws or enforce them. But he did hold symbolic authority, signing official documents, overseeing debates, even managing foreign correspondence. In fact, Hanson approved the Great Seal of the United States, the same emblem still pressed on official documents today. In a sense, Hanson was America's first test run of a president, proof that the young nation could have a singular figurehead, however symbolic, and yet his name faded. Why? Because history loves simple narratives. It is far easier to tell schoolchildren Washington was the first president than to explain the messy truth of the Articles of Confederation. But the story doesn't end with neglect. It takes a dramatic twist. In the late 1800s, photography had become widespread, and an entirely different John Hanson came into focus. This John Hanson was a black man, a leader in Liberia Nation, founded for formerly enslaved Africans who had returned from America. Dressed in 19th century attire, his portrait circulated in newspapers and eventually in books, and much later on the internet. The confusion was inevitable. People saw the caption John Hanson beneath the photo of a dignified black statesman and assumed it was the same. John Hanson, who had been president under the Articles. The two identities, one white, one black, collapsed into each other. By the late 20th century, this mix-up had turned into a legend. On message boards, in community centers, and later on social media, the claim spread like wildfire. The first president of the United States was a black man, but they erased him from history. Think about why this story resonated. For centuries, black Americans had been told they had no place in the founding of the nation. Heroes were white. Inventors were white. Leaders were white. The erasure of black contributions was systemic and relentless. So when the possibility appeared, however mistaken, that the very first president had been a black man, it struck like lightning. It was a narrative of resistance, of reclamation, of rewriting history in the face of centuries of denial. Of course, historians push back. They point out the timelines don't match. The records are clear, and the two John Hansons lived in different centuries. The president of 1781 was white, not black. The Liberian statesman was a separate man entirely. But here's the deeper truth. Whether or not John Hanson was black, the myth revealed something essential. It exposed a hunger for recognition, a demand for visibility, a refusal to accept the whitewashed version of America's founding. The legend of John Hanson, the black president, isn't just about mistaken identity. It's about the struggle to reclaim space in a history that has so often shut its doors. Why does this story matter? At first glance, it might seem like nothing more than a historical misunderstanding to men. One name and a century of confusion. But the story of John Hanson carries a weight far beyond a trivia fact. It forces us to confront how history is written, who gets remembered, and who is erased. Let us start with the simplest question. What does it mean to be the first president? For the United States, the official answer is George Washington, inaugurated in 1789 under the Constitution. That's what's written in textbooks, printed on posters, and etched into national identity. But the existence of John Hanson, elected in 1781, complicates the narrative. His title was real. His signature was real. His leadership, however limited, was real. Yet his name faded because it didn't fit the story America wanted to tell about itself. This is the first impact. History is not neutral. It is curated, simplified, and often sanitized to create myths that hold a nation together. Washington, the war hero and unifying figure, was the perfect beginning for a young country searching for heroes. Hanson, the bureaucrat of a weak government, was not. So he was quietly forgotten. But then comes the second impact, the myth of John Hanson as a black president. Even if historians debunk it, the fact that millions of people embraced the story reveals something powerful. It shows how deeply black Americans have been denied visibility in their own country's founding. It shows the hunger for narratives where black people are not enslaved, not marginalized, but leading. In a way, the myth itself became an act of Protestant insistence that black contributions to America's history deserve to be recognized, even if mainstream history refuses to acknowledge them. This raises a bigger question. If we cling so tightly to the myth of Washington as the first president, or Hanson as the black president, what else have we oversimplified? What other figures have been erased because their stories didn't fit the national script? Think about it. How many school children learn about Crispus Attucks, the black man killed in the Boston Massacre, often called the first casualty of the American Revolution? How many learn about the black soldiers who fought in every war from the Revolution onward? How many learn about inventors, scientists, and diplomats of color whose names are buried under white counterparts. The Hanson story, whether true or myth, opens the door to these questions. It invites us to look at history not as a fixed timeline, but as a battlefield of memory. On one side, the polished version told in classrooms. On the other, the messy, diverse, often uncomfortable reality. And perhaps the greatest impact is this: legends, even when false, reveal the truths we wish were real. The legend of John Hanson as a black president reveals a deep longing for inclusion, a demand for representation, and a challenge to the idea that America's founding was a story written only by white men. So, when people say, John Hanson was the first president, they might not be speaking historically, but they are speaking symbolically. And symbols, as history has shown us, can be just as powerful as facts. So where does this leave us? The truth is layered. Historically, John Hanson was indeed elected in 1781 as the first president of the United States in Congress assembled under the Articles of Confederation. But that office was weak, symbolic, and very different from the presidency created by the Constitution. George Washington rightfully holds the title of the first constitutional president, the leader with true executive power. As for the claim that Hanson was a black man, this is where legend outpaces fact. The photo of John Hanson from Liberia belongs to a completely different man, living decades later. The historical Hanson of 1781 was white. On the surface, the myth is false. And yet, sometimes myths tell us as much about the present as they do about the past. The viral story of John Hanson, the forgotten black president, has endured because it speaks to something America still struggles with: the selective way it remembers. Who gets a statue whose face goes on the money? Who gets written into the first chapter of the National Story? Who gets left out? The John Hanson legend forces us to ask uncomfortable but vital questions. If history erased him, who else has it erased? If even the presidency can be contested, how reliable are the stories we've been told about science, invention, war, and art? And if so many black figures have been buried by the textbooks, how do we begin to uncover them again? Because, in the end, the Hanson story isn't really about one man. It's about power. It's about memory. It's about the struggle to claim a place in the story of a nation that too often forgets the people who built it. And maybe that's why the myth will not die. Even if historians correct the record, the idea of a black man serving as America's first president has power. It flips the script. It shakes the foundations of what we thought we knew. And it demands that we look harder, dig deeper, and question more. So, was John Hanson the first president of the United States? Technically, yes, under the Articles of Confederation. Was he a black man erased from history. No, not in fact, but the legend reveals a deeper truth. That history is never finished. That it is contested ground. And that the stories we choose to tell say as much about us as they do about the past. And that brings us to you. What do you think? Should Hanson be remembered alongside Washington as America's first president? Does the myth of a forgotten black president change the way you view history? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this story with someone who only ever heard the simple version of America's founding. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden figures, the erased geniuses, the buried leaders, subscribe, because we've only just begun to dig. History isn't written in stone. It's written in memory, and memory can be rewritten.